Hi everyone, here we are with the last content review video for Unit 4, Agriculture. Here we're uh, looking at not quite the basics of agriculture. We're going to change this actually. And we're really looking ahead to what we call modern issues in agriculture, right? So we looked at the basics: intensive, extensive agriculture, subsistence and commercial, et cetera, the types of agriculture and agricultural regions. Then we looked at land use over time, right? How the use of agricultural land has changed over time. Here today, we're looking at some modern issues, contemporary issues that agricultural uh, teams and members of agricultural working society are facing nowadays. Now, a lot of what you've heard and a lot of what you've learned can relate back to, or at least what the public has seen, relates back to this distinction between um, what we call our sustainability, right? And like any other measure of development, any other impact of development, sustainability is going to be at the forefront of a lot of people's minds, a lot of researchers' minds, scientists' minds, farmers' minds, etc. And the sustainability, again, is using Earth's natural resources in a way that preserves them for future generations. So we're worried about right now, but we're also concerned with the future, right? Ensuring that whatever resources are available to us are going to be here for posterity, right? For longevity's sake. And we have different pillars of this because we're always trying to balance sustainability with our own needs as human beings, as people. So we have these three different pillars of sustainability that need to work together in order to truly be sustainable for our planet. All right. Now these are social, with human society behaviors, the practices that we do, and the consequences of those actions incurred by the earth. We need to be conscious of both our consequences, or the consequences of our actions, and also the necessary actions needed to be taken by us now that we've gone and developed as much as we have. The environment naturally is going to be a major pillar here, thinking of the earth itself and the resources themselves, and ensuring that they're in good standing and good health, and our economic standing. Because whether we agree to it or not, like it or not, a lot of the practices done that affect the environment or that are results of our own social behaviors are done with this profit-driven mindset, right? Making sure that wages and salaries and profits are still had in this trend towards more sustainable practices. All of these three working together and working in balance and cohesion is what leads to true sustainable action, right? At least as far as we've seen. Whether you think one is more important than the other, it's of course up to debate, but this is what we're looking at when we think about these modern issues, right? Making sure that the practices we do are sustainable. Now, this issue in agriculture typically comes down to one divide, what we call this organic and conventional agricultural divide. So organic agriculture we can think of as any type of agriculture that avoids the use of herbicides, pesticides, growth hormones. It's the general definition that we look to. It's a little tricky here because it's not quite covering all our bases, because organic farms, whether you think about it or not, do use herbicides, pesticides. It's just not the usual ones that we think of. So we have this divide between organic and conventional agriculture, or traditional agriculture, that is non-organic, which is kind of a misnomer because organic was the original agriculture, right, before. I digress. So we're thinking of natural fertilizers or pesticides, right? And organic farming does use fertilizer. It's just in the form of a natural fertilizer like manure. It does use, on the other hand, in conventional agriculture uses chemical fertilizers, right? Human-made or human-developed fertilizers. It does use pesticides in the form of things such as diatomaceous earth, right? These little shellings, residuals of mollusk shells and things like that. To drive away pests and insects. Conventional agriculture uses chemical pesticides, human-made pesticides instead. So there isn't this distinction really between the use of herbicides and pesticides, fertilizers, and not using them. It's more about the use of either human-made or I guess, earthen-made, natural, or quote unquote, fertilizers and pesticides. If you're using the natural stuff and you're not using any of the chemical products, chemical here meaning human-made or human-developed products, because there are chemicals in just about everything, then you're going to fall into organic agriculture. And if you're not opposed to using the human-made, human-developed fertilizers, pesticides, right, the green revolution stuff is what we usually think of, you're going to fall into this conventional or traditional agriculture category. Now that said, the one big distinction is going to be use or non-use of GMOs. Organic agriculture is not going to use GMOs to the best of their ability, right? We have a lot of products that are genetically modified as they are, right? And as they've been, we think of pea plants and from Mendel, or for those of you remembering your biology stuff, or just the domestication of plants in general, right? That is a form of genetic modification, right? Choosing the plants that you like and only planting or breeding those over time, creating this new variety. It's a more crude, more basic form of genetic modification, right? Because today we have gene splicing and things where we can literally take DNA and insert it into the DNA strands of another organism. But it's genetic modification nonetheless, just not to the level that we see it today. Now, that being said, conventional agriculture is going to use GMOs. They're not opposed to using it, antibiotics, growth hormones, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the big impacts that we really think of, aside from this organic conventional divide, are with pollution, right? And that's generally going to be the impact that we see from industrial production and from agricultural production. Pollution is kind of the big impact that we see. Now, there are different types of pollution, and when you're writing about pollution or writing about degradation, it's kind of the fancy way to call it, you have to be specific about the type that you're talking about, because there is, at least for our purposes, air, water, and soil pollution in relation to agriculture. And just because you say a result is pollution, it's not going to be enough, right? Or a negative impact is pollution, you have to be more specific. What type of pollution are you thinking of? And even more than that, how exactly is that pollution occurring? How is it happening, right? Now, with air pollution, we have some pretty traditional causes, and that are some which are linked to agricultural practices in general, and others which are just kind of general results of human behavior living. So greenhouse gas emissions are generally the air pollution that we think of when we're thinking about air pollution, especially CO2, carbon dioxide, being released into the air, and we can see that as a result of exhaust, right, from machinery, from vehicles, from the combines themselves that are harvesting crops or collecting crops, to the trucks and transportation that's transporting vegetables or fruits to and from places, from farm to store or farm to market. And those are pretty traditional causes of CO2 emissions, right? Because that happens regardless of any vehicle and any type of machinery that uses petroleum-based product or gasoline to run, right? The second one, more in line with agricultural practices in specific, is residuals of aerosols, right? So residuals being they're hanging around. Aerosols are going to be anything that's been aerized or aerated, right? Made into a gas or aerosolized product. In this case, we're thinking of pesticides and fertilizers. We can kind of see this here, right, with the spray. And some of you may have seen family members or go out into the yard and they have to spray for ants or for other bugs, fleas and ticks and things like that, right? Well, this is also part of air pollution, right? These particles are going to hang around in the air and may even, right, we see like these masks, but these masks generally may not be enough, right? Especially if it's just a cloth mask that you're looking at for being this close to the aerosolized products. We look at India, right? We think of specific impacts of these developments, of pesticides, right, being sprayed into the air, herbicides, or what have you, and adversely affecting people in those areas. For water pollution, again, we're being specific to water. We're not going to have quite the same effect, right? We're not going to call these residuals because those residuals are in the air itself. Really, we're thinking about runoff in this case, right? The pesticide, herbicide has gotten into the soil. Rain comes in to wash away what it will wash away, and that can end up in streams, water sources, and eventually make its way into larger bodies of water. This runoff in particular is a cause of water pollution because you have increased concentrations of these specific chemicals specifically related to pesticides, fertilizers, and herbicides, which can prove harmful to native life in those bodies of water. Now, aside from this, and kind of a far-reaching effect, is going to be this uh, extra effective runoff when we get a lot of fertilizers, pesticides, fertilizers in specific into a body of water, like on a coast in a bay, which is what we call algal blooms or red tide. When we're thinking about harmful algal blooms, is what we call them. So here we're looking at runoff, specifically looking at things like increases of nitrogen. So the algal bloom relates to the algae, which is a plant, which itself is going to grow when there's a lot of fertilizer that's present. In this case, the fertilizer, what's relevant of the fertilizer is the nitrogen that's in it, which can end up in these bay areas, these coastlines. Red tide is going to happen regardless, right? It's kind of this natural occurring process in certain parts of the world. This nitrogen just makes it worse. It exacerbates or makes worse the issue. And so we see this rapid growth of this red tide, and the specific algae that's growing, these specific types are toxic. Right? So they release these toxins that are going to be harmful to fish and surrounding life. More than that, because there's so much of this stuff, the algae eventually dies. And as that algae decays, it also releases off these kind of harmful toxins as it decays, like any decaying thing would. And that process draws in these phytoplankton. Like they're going to eat the algae, they're going to eat things that are there. Those processes take up oxygen, which sucks oxygen out of these water sources, which creates a sort of dead zone where there's not enough oxygen available. So even for a longer period of time, anything that relies on oxygen, like fish and wildlife, who are in the water most of the time or dependent upon being in the water, will also die because there's just not enough of this oxygen that's going around. This is kind of a long-lasting effect of this runoff, right? But we do see this time to time in Louisiana, Florida, parts of Texas, right? This is in, some of you may recognize this place, right? Now for soil impacts, we're looking at causes of soil pollution and these impacts themselves. And much like before, we're going to look at things like runoff and pesticides. Overuse of land, depletion of soil can lead to an arid state. This specifically is what we're looking at when we think of desertification. So these nutrients kind of oversaturate the soil, and that land is overused, which can lead to soil nutrients being depleted. And over time, that's going to mean that those soil nutrients can't quite hang on to what's left. We end up in this dry, arid state because the land is no longer as arable as it once was. Salinization occurs as well with the use of fertilizers, especially. We're looking at things like leftover salts from the fertilizer, like sodium chloride and potassium chloride. When you use saline water for irrigation, so if you're along coastlines like this, even if you're more inland near freshwater sources, there still may be a higher saline content, a higher salt content, which over time can oversalinate the soil. Too much of a good thing, right? In this case, salts are not necessarily a bad thing for soil. There are already salts in soil that help plants develop and help plants grow, but too much of them can lead to a loss of water because those salts are going to absorb the water that's in the soil, and it's not going to be able to get into the plant, and that's where we can get other issues. For agricultural development in general, despite these specific causes, effects, impacts, the world itself is different than it was 200 years ago, right? And we have this new idea of agricultural interdependence, which you see every day, or which you did see every day, going to a grocery store, eating in schools, looking at commercials on TV. The fact is that the world agricultural, the relationship of world agriculture has become a globalized one. And agriculture itself is globalized, much like any other product for consumption. And as a result, we see this interdependence where different regions of the world are dependent upon other regions of the world for agricultural products. Now, what this means in general is that a lot of the intensive work and manual labor type of work can be outsourced and is outsourced to LDCs, where we see these types of more manual labory jobs, which maybe require more physical labor, physicality, or which are just in general a tougher job to do. Seeing these outsourced to LDCs instead of remaining in LDCs. So we see things like plantation agriculture, shifting cultivation, which are going to be outsourced, right? Coffee production here, the map that we're looking at, being a type of plantation agriculture. And we find this and we can see the trend is, yes, along tropical regions because it needs that type of climate to survive and to grow well. But more on that, these are all going to be LDCs or NICs, right? We're not seeing a lot of major coffee producing countries in the northern parts of North America, in Western Europe, Eastern Europe, right? A lot of this is happening in developing regions. And it's not an accident, right? It's, again, about this outsourcing, right? Shifting work to other areas so that it's cheaper or so that profits can be higher either way. Now, there's, of course, this issue of being exploitative, where we don't want to have these less developed countries or developing countries at risk for being exploited. But the fact of the matter is that they have been over time, right, where these larger companies can kind of overcompensate and make a region dependent upon a single crop. Right? We end up with a monoculture in that case. And those issues can lead to economic stagnation, because if you think of areas in Central America who are producing coffee or bananas or what have you, if that's their main exporting product, then they're kind of at the whims of whoever's going to buy those products themselves. Coffee itself is a luxury good, right? It's not a commodity crop, so it can't be sold for cheap. It's going to be sold to be more expensive to turn profits. Right? Think of your Starbucks and your coffee shops, right? It's a more expensive product than an orange or a banana or an apple or a bag of rice, right? Rice would be kind of the staple commodity crop. And coffee and things like that are much more expensive to buy than just the rice itself. What this leads to is something we talked about with Wallerstein and Rostow. Wallerstein in particular, where you're kind of locked into your development status, in this case locked into the primary sector, because you're being forced to depend on that one type of economic practice, and you're not really able to expand or explore other options because most of your money is coming from this one type of work, producing this particular agricultural product. And if you shift away from that, you may not have enough money to survive the shift, right? And it's an issue that we see. This is where we have things like fair trade that come in, where organizations are aiming to provide fair wages and fair compensation for the work being done, especially in developing countries and especially for resources and luxury crops like coffee, so that the agricultural workers and farm owners can be paid what they should be paid, right? Especially relative to the extreme profits that coffee sourcing countries are receiving. Right? You think again back to your Starbucks. Outside of this globalized landscape, we also have to think about the fact that there are gender disparities in agriculture. We do see these differences between men and women in agriculture in terms of access, in terms of production. Now here we have sources of information about the share of female employees within each of these different types of agricultural practices. In Kenya, about 75% of the employees are female. In Senegal, 60%. And we can see all of these are going to trend mostly 50% and higher. We have a few that are a little lower, 41%, 35%. For the most part, we have large portions of the agricultural workforce identifying as women, right, being female in this case. Now, what that means for us is that there's going to have to be equal or at least equitable access to agricultural sources. If not, there's going to be a disparity in production itself, right? If men and women are not receiving the same sorts of benefits, we're not going to see the same level of agricultural production. And that's an issue in a lot of these countries when you think about the fact that a majority of the workers are female. And if they're not receiving the same resources as male workers in these countries, that's a huge gap in, one, gender access and inclusivity, and two, agricultural production potential, right? When you're kind of handicapping the majority of your workforce, it doesn't make sense. But these also goes back to cultural landscape issues, gender attitudes, beliefs, etc. Now, overall, if we look regionally up until now, or something more recent to 2010, we've seen general trends of female workers increasing in the agricultural labor force. in most regions. Now, in Europe, Western and Eastern included, we have an average of NIC MDC development. So we've seen declines in that share. Fewer and fewer women working in the agricultural workforce, and we're seeing that become more even, or we're seeing that at least share deeply diminish. Not to say it's a bad thing for women to be in agriculture, but being in just that primary sector can sometimes be a not so great thing. In other areas, we've only seen this increase, which only speaks to the necessity to increase gender-inclusive practices when it comes to accessing agricultural resources. Overall, if we had these same accesses for women as men do in a lot of these countries, we could see up to 30% increases in yield over time, right? And it's not just an issue of doing what's right by each grouping, right? Ensuring that there is equitable access for men and women, but it's also about the long-term implications of providing equitable access for all of your agricultural workers, right? Because if you're not meeting those standards, there's production that's lost, right? So economically, you're kind of putting one arm behind your back and not allowing yourself to work with the full power that your workforce could, all right? If you're inhibiting women in this way by not allowing them to have equal or equitable access to agricultural resources, especially if they're in the majority of agricultural workers. Second to that, if you have issues with hunger, with access to food security, or with having food security, you're also putting the other hand behind your back, because these women who could, one, help improve the economy if you're in a primary sector and they're not having equal access to resources, they can, two, produce more food and more products, more produce, more goods to help stave off any hunger, food insecurity issues in the first place. Right? These issues coincide, right? This is not just an environmental issue or an agricultural issue. This is also a social issue, right? In terms of gender attitudes and gender norms, what's expected of women, what's expected of men, what's provided to women versus what's provided to men in some of these regions, in some of these areas. And how the relationship between, percentage of women in a particular field and percentage of men in a particular field can affect other factors like sustainability of resources, right? Maybe there should be more access to these practices in general, if nothing else, because there's products and inputs and outputs that are not being achieved, that are not being realized, even if for the right reason we want to look for equitable access regardless, whether it's to gender disparity or any other type of disparity. This altogether is our modern issues in agriculture. Hopefully you found this helpful and it was beneficial to you. Here's hoping you're happy, healthy, and safe, and we'll see you in Unit 5 for the political unit.